Hi everyone and welcome back to a new episode of Diagnosedan. Today we are working on a 2007 Mercedes 280 E-Class. And the customer complaint is that the engine won't crank. Or to be more specific, it won't crank when the engine is hot. As long as this car is cold, it cranks every time. But as soon as the engine has warmed up, it refuses to crank. So let's diagnose this Mercedes together. The only thing I did so far is remove some of these plastic covers. Now this engine is cold right now. I can even touch the exhaust. The customer told me that when this engine is cold, it always cranks. But as soon as the engine heats up, it refuses to crank. Now to confirm we don't have a problem when this engine is cold, in the next step, I'm going to crank this engine 5 times. As you could see, absolutely no problem when this engine is cold, just like the customer told us. Now to confirm we do have a problem when this engine is hot, we need to run this engine to allow it to get up to operating temperature, and after that we're going to crank it again. The engine has warmed up, and according to the customer, every time the engine is hot, it won't crank anymore until the engine has cooled down again. So let's see what happens. Let's try again. And that's customer complaint confirmed. The customer is absolutely right. This Mercedes does not crank when the engine is hot. Now there are many things that could prevent this engine from cranking. I mean, there's the immobilizer, ignition switch, starter motor relay, park neutral switch, brake light switch. I mean, there's too many things. I wouldn't know where to start. So in the next step, we're gonna scan the car for codes, and hopefully there's something in there that gives us a clue where to start our diagnostics. I did a full system scan and most systems came up with no fault codes. Now there is a fault code stored in the engine computer, and I was kind of expecting this because the check engine light is on. But that fault code is for an inlet camshaft solenoid, and I'm pretty sure that won't prevent this car from cranking. Now there are other fault codes stored in the ABS, in a door module, and in a mobile phone adapter, but I'm also pretty sure that's not what's causing our no crank. Almost all systems pass without any fault codes. We do have got a fault code stored in the engine computer for a camshaft solenoid, in a door module for a heated mirror, in a phone adapter for a microphone, and there is a history code in the ABS for low voltage on a solenoid. But none of these codes should prevent this engine from cranking. Now where should we start? Now don't panic. We're going to start out by doing some basic checks. We're going to see if the starter motor cranks when we try to operate it manually. To rule out we don't simply have a bad starter motor that fails when it heats up from the engine heat. B, we're going to check if there's a starter motor command. Now both these things can easily be checked at the starter motor relay. To find the starter motor relay, we have to take a look at service data. In this case, the starter motor relay is conveniently placed right there. Now this is the underhood fuse box, and when we take a look at the picture I found in Autodata, this should be our starter motor relay L. Now, as you can see, it's located right next to that big 40 amp fuse. Now from here, we should be able to manually operate the starter motor. When we take a closer look at the starter motor relay, we can see on this relay, like on most relays, there's a schematic which is very convenient. When we take a closer look to the schematics on the relay, we can learn that the control side is between pin 1 and 2. The switch is between pin 3 and 5. I took a look at the wiring diagram and I've learned that pin 5 should be a power, and when the switch closes, that power can flow from pin 5 to pin 3 and activate the starter motor. We should be able to manually activate the starter motor by applying a power to pin 3, which is this pin in the fuse box. When I apply power with my power probe to pin 3, in theory, that starter motor should crank. Now, I quickly reinstalled the starter motor relay moments ago to check if our problem is still there, because we gotta take into account while we are diagnosing this car is cooling down. Now, it didn't start, so if it does start by applying a voltage to pin 3, we can rule out the starter motor being our problem. So the starter motor is not our issue. So in the next step, we're going to take a look at the control side of the relay. The ignition is turned on, and when the ignition is on, there should be power on pin 1 of the relay. Now, according to the relay, this should be pin 1, so that should be this pin in the fuse box. Now, when I hook up my test light to ground, and I touch that pin, the test light should light up. And it does, so there is power on pin 1 of the relay. So right next to pin 1, there is pin 2, and I'm going to put this little connector in pin 2, and I've got my test light hooked up to battery positive. So when I touch a ground, the test light should light up, and it does. Now, pin 2 should be a switch ground when we attempt to crank the engine. So when I put my test light in that connector, and I attempt to crank the engine, the test light should light up. So attempting to crank the engine right now, there we go, and cranking, and cranking, and as you can see, the test light does not light up. So somehow this relay is not being controlled. As you could see, the starter motor relay is not being controlled. And if the starter motor relay is not being controlled, of course the starter motor is never going to crank. Now the big question is, why is the starter motor relay no longer being controlled when the car reaches its operating temperature? In the next step, I want to take a closer look at the electronic ignition switch, which is a part of the car's immobilizer system. I want to use the scan tool to take a look at scan data. Before we do so, we need to understand two things. Terminal 15 is the key on position. So when I turn the ignition on, terminal 15 should change from off to on. Terminal 50 is the crank position. So when I attempt to crank the engine, terminal 50 should change from off to on. If it does so, in theory, this car should crank. Right now we're in the scan data for the electronic ignition switch. We can see there is no key in the ignition switch and both terminal 15s are off. Terminal 50, which is the crank position, is also off. Now let's put the key in the ignition switch and turn the ignition on. Right now we can see that there is a key in the ignition switch and both terminal 15s are on. Of course, terminal 50 is still off. Now let's attempt to crank the engine. We can see that terminal 50 changes from off to on. So in theory, this car should crank. So we got no relevant fault code stored. We've got a cranking signal coming from the ignition switch. The starter motor is good, the starter relay is good, but we've got no control when it's hot. Really, this car should crank. Now, I took a cup of coffee and parked the car in this part of my shop to let it cool down for an hour to show you guys that when it's cooled down, we no longer have a problem. Now, of course, when the starter motor is cranking, the starter motor relay is being controlled. Now, to show you what that looks like, I'm going to remove the relay, put my little connector into the control pin of the relay, and this relay is ground side switched. So I'm going to hook up my test light to battery positive. And when I crank the engine, of course the test light should light up. And as you can see, it does. So absolutely no problems when the car is cooled down. Now let's take a look at a wiring diagram. The diagram tells us that the ignition switch is not directly in control of the starter motor relay. Instead, it puts the crank command on the CAN bus. It then runs through a CAN bus connector, and it's then being received by the engine computer. The engine computer is the one directly in control of the starter motor relay, so that signal is coming from the engine computer and not from the ignition switch. Now, which of the components in the diagram could actually heat up? Could it be the ignition switch? Well, I don't think so. It's placed inside the cabin, and inside the cabin, it doesn't really get very hot. But after looking at this diagram, I did get suspicious about one particular component, and that's because of its awkward location. Because on this car, the engine computer is placed directly on top of the engine, and an engine gets hot. So my theory is, when the engine heats up, it heats up the computer, and when the computer is hot, it no longer controls the starter motor relay. Now, on closer inspection, my suspicion actually got stronger, because it looks like in the past, this computer has already been repaired. So to test my theory, I'm gonna take this heat gun and heat up the computer, and only the computer, nothing else. So I'm gonna heat up the computer, attempt to crank the engine, heat it up, crank the engine, heat it up, crank it, until hopefully at some point the engine will stop cranking and my theory is confirmed. And it no longer cranks. Ha! As you can see, the only thing that is hot is my heat gun and the engine computer. Now, although I'm pretty sure we found a problem, we need to be thorough. So I'm going to do a continuity and a resistance check between the control pin of the relay and the pin in the connector of the computer. Now I think it's this pin over here. And it is. And we've got 0.2 of an ohm, 0.1, 0.2 of an ohm. So that's perfect. Next, I'm going to do a wiggle test. And if something's wrong, we're going to lose that beep. And there's nothing wrong with our wiring harness. So I'm going to do one last thing. I'm going to do a pin drag test. And if that turns out to be fine, I'm going to call it a bad computer. I opened the computer and I could definitely see someone had been in there before, because the sealant they used was definitely not how it left the factory. And actually, I had a very hard time opening it. I did a quick visual and I could see nothing obviously wrong with it. Now, I could do some more testing, but I had a talk with the owner of the car, which is a very nice lady. And she told me, Dan, this is an old computer. It's been repaired before. If we're going to repair it again, what's going to fail next? Please order a new one. And I told her, this is not going to be cheap. She says, I know, but I need this car to be reliable for my job, so please do. So I kind of think she's got a point. So I'm going to order a new one. And once it comes in, all we need to do is program it, and this car should be fixed. After the repair, the customer picked up the car and she's been driving for quite some time now. And she told me that the car cranks every time, even when the engine is hot. Now, a lot of people think that diagnosing a car is just stopping by a shop, hooking it up to a scan tool and read the fault codes. Now, this video is a classic example that this is absolutely not the case. I mean, there is no fault code. P10,000, when the engine heats up, the engine computer no longer controls the starter motor relay. It's just not how it works. Now, lately, I've been getting a lot of questions if there is an automotive textbook that I can recommend. Now, the latest book I've been reading is this book written by Tom Denton. Tom has been writing best-selling automotive textbooks for over 25 years, and I have had the privilege to be a small part in his latest edition. So if you want to become a skilled diagnostician, please take a look at one of Tom's books. Now, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe to my channel, and when you hit the little bell, you will get a notification each time I upload a new video. And remember, Diagnosedan, fixed it again. See you next time, guys.